Hi, I'm Vikram Kumaran, and in this presentation, I will be talking about research done by Bradford, Mott, James Lester, and me, generating game levels for multiple distinct games with a common Latent space. The motivation for this work is threefold. First, we ask the question, when looking at a set of games that have similar gameplay, 2D arcade games in our case, are there shared patterns of how the various game elements are distributed in the game, even when the games look visually very different? If yes, is it possible to capture such shared patterns in a low-dimensional Latent space where each point in the space represents a game level in multiple games? And all these game levels have similar gameplay. If the answer is yes to the above two questions, can we actually train a generator that will take a random point in the Latent space and generate game levels in different games? And will they all have mirrored gameplays? We answer in the affirmative to all these three questions, and in the subsequent slides, I will walk you through how we did it. The way we approached the problem was first select the games for our analysis. We used the general video game AI framework and the video game definition language as our game representation for our tests. The four games that we selected are Boulder Dash, Link, Zelda, and Roguelike. The reasons these games were selected was because they follow grid physics, have similar actions, and the game elements like keys or spiders have similar mappings in the other games. Even though there's a mapping between the sprites, a one-to-one replacement usually does not generate a valid game. Below on the bottom left, we show the VGDL textual representation. On the bottom right, the corresponding game visual generated by the framework. We use a novel technique to generate the training corpus. This approach is similar to the work done by Shaker and team by mapping timelines into game levels. We start with a set of points or destinations in the grid. We then pick a random sequence of actions that will take us from the starting point to the goal point. The actions could include things like pick up a key or kill a monster. We then place obstacles in the path to match the actions in the previous series and place them on the grid along the path. We take the same sequence of actions to generate 4 different game levels for the 4 distinct games we selected. So finally, each action sequence ends up with 4 game levels in different games, but all of them have similar gameplay, because gameplay is determined by the action sequence, which is of course common in this case. Here's an example of 2 sets of levels generated from our approach. Each set has 4 games. One can see from the sprite locations that they have similar gameplay starting at the top left, going down to the bottom right. While some of the sprites like scorpions and spiders map one-to-one, other sprites like walls and boulders have placements that are unique to the specific game. The game sprite patterns are sufficiently different, but the gameplay is very similar. We generate thousands of such 4 game sets as our training corpus for the game. Now that we have the training set, we use a novel branched GAN to train for multiple game levels in parallel. Each sprite is encoded as a separate channel, and a game level is a binary grid with as many channels as sprites. After a few common convolutional levels, the GAN branches into 4 level branches with 4 outputs. There is 1 generator, but each game has its own discriminator. So there are 4 discriminators. The intuition is that the common layer starting from the latent vector input captures the shared structure of the games, while the branches that come further down captures the differences. The loss for the generator is the average binary cross entropy across all 4 games, and each discriminator loss is of course specific to that game. We train using a GPU using 5,000 training samples, where each training sample is a set of 4 game levels, 1 for each game. And the number of epochs trained was around 1,200, and the batch size was 64. The discriminator had about a 30% drop-off. Now let's look at the generated game levels. Here we show 4 examples of game level sets. One can see how the sprite patterns are mimicked across the different games, indicating similar gameplay. The generator also captures individual game-specific characteristics like placement of boulders on top of diamonds in Boulder Dash on the leftmost column. Um, However, the generator sometimes misses the mark and generates impossible or trivial games. For example, in the second row, roguelike, all the way to the right, you actually see walls with gaps. And way in the bottom, the last row, we have a very, very simple game with an open layout, no walls, no locks, none of those things, which makes it very easy to play. Now, to show what the GAN is really learning, let us look at this example from Boulder Dash. We selected two latent vectors at random. The game level generated from these vectors are the two games on the bottom left. We then added the two latent vectors to get a new vector and generated a game that is shown on the bottom right. One can see that the combined vector has a sprite patterns from the other two. So this gives us an intuition that the GAN is learning a representation of the patterns of sprites in the game levels and mapping them from points on the latent space to those patterns shared across the different games. Now that we have the generated levels, we evaluate the generated levels based on three criteria, namely solvability, gameplay similarity, and novelty. To test for solvability, we just run an automated agent provided by the GVG AI framework. We give this agent up to 2,000 time steps and have 5 attempts to solve the level. And if the level is solved in those constraints, under those constraints, then it is considered solvable. Now, for the other two metric, we first identify an ideal path or the shortest path through the level that needs to be solved. We make some simplifying assumptions that monsters do not move and the game layout is kind of static. We use Dijkstra's shortest path algorithm to generate the path. The level example on the right shows one solution for a Zelda game level. Remember, solving the level might require detours to pick up keys or avoid monsters, etc. The ideal path is then used to evaluate gameplay similarity and novelty. We calculate the ideal path for the 4 game levels in a single generated sample, where each level is from a different game. And then we take a pairwise similarity distance and average it to give gameplay similarity across games. For novelty, we'll do it a little bit differently. We take the action sequence in the ideal path and then pick 2 game levels from the same game from different samples and see how far apart are the action sequences between these levels. And we use Levenstein's distance to calculate the distance. So novelty represents, so novelty is because if a player requires completely different action sequence to solve 2 levels, then these levels are novel relative to each other, right? So that is why we use the action sequence. The thing to note is that gameplay similarity distance is measured between game levels of different games, not the same game, different games. So they are done on a single sample. While novelty is a distance measured between game levels of the same game across samples. So novelty is across samples, gameplay is within a sample across games. Moving on to results. First, let's look at solvability. Based on the automated agents playing the game, as explained earlier, about 50% of the generated game levels on average were solvable. The unsolvable levels were primarily due to either missing elements like locks without keys or blocked paths, as in walls with no way to get past them. Among the games, Boulder Dash seems to have a higher solvability fraction, possibly because it does not have any dependency between actions like need to pick up a key before you can pass a lock, which makes it a little easier to solve. The second metric we look at is gameplay similarity across games. We take 3 groups of examples. The first group contains sets of 4 games where each game level is randomly chosen from our training examples, which is the baseline. So you would expect this group to have the lowest gameplay similarity because it's a random set of games, game levels. This is corroborated, as you can see, from the distribution of the similarity distance in the chart. The second group consists of our training corpus samples. These levels were custom built to be similar, so you expect this group to have the highest similarity between the gameplay, which is also something you notice in the graph. We then look at our generated sample group. we see where it falls in the spectrum. Based on the Wasserstein distance, which is a measure of distance between distributions, we see that the generated samples are closer to the training group and further away from the baseline, which means that they have similar gameplay like the training group and are not like the baseline group. Finally, moving on to novelty, where we look at the action sequence distance between levels of a single game. We take 100 games from the training samples, 100 games from the generated samples for each of the 4 games. We then calculate pairwise inter-game level action sequence distance. We then plot the distribution of these distances. Since GANs are trained to mimic the training set, if the novelty distance distribution matches the training set, we know that we've captured all the variety seen in the training set, which is the best we can do. We see from the charts here that we were able to capture all the inter-game level distances in the training set very well with our GAN. To conclude, we successfully captured the shared patterns across games in a low-dimensional latent space. We trained a novel branched GAN to generate levels in 4 distinct games, starting from the same seed. We also showcased a promising new technique to create training sets, starting from a prescribed gameplay and build levels from there. We believe we've answered all the questions we posed in the first slide. To move on to future work, the questions that we hope to explore are, can we increase the set of games covered by this approach? Right now it's restricted to 2D arcade kind of games. Can we make the latent representation richer by capturing some of the dynamic aspects of the game, not just the static sprite locations? Also, is there room for improvement on how we generate the training corpus? Currently we're using rules. Maybe answer set programming will make it more general. Finally, I would like to thank my fellow authors for their input, help, and guidance, and thank the AID conference for this opportunity. Thank you.